I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by two of not just the leading experts on a whole range of topics, but actually, as I look back at the interviews we've done over the years, going back to 2022, two of the most prescient and prophetic as well. It's my absolute delight to welcome Keir Giles and Orysia Lutsevych. We're going to be talking about a Chatham House paper today. Really, and the central part of that paper is warning that a ceasefire in Ukraine should not be confused with peace. Obviously, given Putin's behavior, a ceasefire itself is potentially quite theoretical and far off. But we can imagine a lot of pressure from Western partners to push Ukraine into perhaps an unsustainable peace, a peace that is not necessarily to Ukraine's advantage. We're going to put details, their full bios, in the description of the video, plus, of course, a link to the paper. I strongly recommend you read that. There are four authors. I will be interviewing the other two authors in a couple of weeks' time. I think you will find this extremely instructive and helpful. And it also gives an insight into some of the conversations that are happening here in Ukraine, which many people won't necessarily be party to. Orysia and Keir, welcome to the channel. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
Good. Yes, good to be back.
Well, we're gonna do ladies first, I think, here, as is only fit and appropriate. Let's start with this idea that actually one of the greatest dangers to Ukraine is not necessarily being under nightly fire, although we have to point out how psychologically traumatizing and physically bad that can happen, especially in a week where an arms event was struck, and indeed many people in my circle were either there, and unfortunately some didn't make it through that. So obviously there's those dangers, but you position that actually the greatest danger could be a ceasefire and Russia's weaponization and manipulation of that in order to gain further advantage.
Yes, Jonathan, since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine back from the days when Crimea was annexed, in Ukraine, there was always a question of how Russia stages and prepares its future escalation using gains that it has acquired in the different stages. So thinking about how this war should end for Ukraine, in order for Ukraine to be safe and in order for Ukraine to be able to be a country it really wants to be, a normal European rule-based prosperous economy. Ukrainian people, Ukrainian elites, and we in global think tanks were thinking, what is that outcome of the war that would allow for Ukraine and for Europe to be secure? That is why just any ending of the war for Ukraine is dangerous, because of that experience, as I have said, from the annexation of Crimea and all the way through negotiations that Russia was imposing on Ukraine through the Normandy format and the Minsk protocols. And like you said, we've been watching Russia using negotiations and settlements as a means of waging the war for all too long. And in the paper, we are giving these examples. That is why Ukraine is very cautious about what is the ingredients of the settlement. And if Russia is not defeated on Ukraine's sovereign territory, it creates the staging ground for a new invasion. And this is what we are warning for Ukraine, but it also is a warning for Europe, because it means that Russia's militarist foreign and defense policy actually pays off if it is able to achieve more territorial conquest in Ukraine and improve its position to threaten both Ukraine and NATO.
And moving on to NATO and Europe here, you make the point that not only is there a danger here of a continued weaponization of a peace environment, but that actually this would give the perfect excuse for European countries, and within that I include the UK, to essentially, I wouldn't even say disarm mentally, but further slide back into the sort of blissful sleep of the dodo, as it were, rather than use that period to rearm and prepare for renewed Russian aggression.
Exactly. Well, as you said, on some levels the ceasefire would be very good news, but also it presents multiple levels of danger. And you referred earlier to the weaponization and manipulation of a ceasefire itself by Russia. That's an absolute given. We know from past experience not only how Russia uses the terms of a ceasefire to set itself up for not only violating it, but the next stage in its wars, but also how Western countries have been repeatedly outmaneuvered and outfoxed by Russia in laying laying down the terms of the ceasefire, which are very one-sided. And in fact, there's a separate report that's been put out specifically on that issue. It's something we cover among the Chatham House authors, but also through ICDS in Tallinn, Russia's ceasefire traps and how Europe can avoid them, that came out in May this year, which goes into a lot more detail about the past history of how Russia sets the conditions for success, and Western countries have been all too eager to sign up to them because they prioritize ending the fighting over the short term, and instead Russia prioritizes winning the war in the long term, which is a very different thing. But when it comes to the end of major combat operations in Ukraine, no matter how many violations may be going on, yes, the danger is twofold. First of all, it's a race to rearm, and Russia will be not only potentially flowing all of those new armed forces back into the military infrastructure that they've been constructing along NATO's eastern periphery, but also they'll be taking advantage of the breathing space to rebuild and reconstitute their armed forces and make them stronger without Ukraine destroying them almost as fast as they can be rebuilt at the same time. So they will vastly accelerate their program to develop the military power that they need for the next phase in their war. Meanwhile, conversely, European politicians are sadly all too likely to see this as the problem going away. As the fighting having ended, therefore we don't need to be too concerned about rearming for the next round. We've already had an Italian minister saying that, well, if there's a ceasefire, plainly Ukraine doesn't need any further support, which is the opposite of the truth. So if European politicians see in a ceasefire an excuse to ease the foot off the throttle for rearmament, for rebuilding their own defensive capacity, then that augments still further this imbalance between what Russia will be preparing for and what Europe will be prepared to defend against.
And we're going to tackle this later, but of course, Russia will manipulate this scenario in many different ways to cause division. We already see that happening in wartime with an extraordinary upswing in, dare I say it, outbursts of violence, also sort of political divisions in Poland. Should we see that actually that would be, accelerated significantly in a peacetime scenario, to those internal divisions within countries, within societies, within allies, Russia would seek to pour, let's say, kerosene onto that? This is a question actually for both of you.
Well, I don't think there will be any dramatically new campaigns because we're already seeing all of the efforts to exploit those divisions, to use all of the old trigger points for pretending that support for a victim of Russia is actually escalatory and dangerous and a form of aggression. So that will certainly increase because, yes, Russia will make the most of the opportunities to portray this as the war being over as opposed to a temporary suspension pending a resumption. And that's something that we need to be very alert to because it will be a very seductive argument, not just for those European politicians I mentioned earlier, but also for European publics who might be looking for good news after all of this time and looking for reasons why the threatened changes that they're going to be subjected to, the things that have to happen in their lives, in their societies, in their economies to be ready to withstand Russia might possibly not be needed after all. So there will be a lot of temptation to sign up to this idea that once there is a ceasefire, the problem has gone away and we can forget about it.
And Jonathan, it's interesting you use the word peacetime yourself, and this is this kind of slippery slope we all will be slipping, kind of lulled into believing because everybody's tired. It's especially eastern flank and Western European countries that they've had enough of it, right? Everybody wants to go back to normality. Focus on the agenda that very much dominated our discourse before the full-scale war in the center of Europe. And I think Putin knows it. And I think this is something that it's only surprising that he would not weaponize this opportunity, hitting so much the dead end on the land war in Ukraine and failing actually to subjugate, to kind of break the will of Ukrainian nation in the home front. I mean, you're in Kyiv and you can see yourself how people are not, yes, it is disturbing these ballistic missiles, but people are not saying, let's, agree to Putin's terms. So I think Putin knows that Ukraine's weakness weakness actually is in the unity of its alliance. And this is where it will hit. And this is where this kind of the settlement it would be presented as peace, and it would stop Ukraine's integration with interoperability and joint production right at the moment when it is accelerating, right? We are seeing right now the big deals being struck, but they're still memorandums. They're not actual production with around these 90 billion, 60 billion that European Union is providing for Ukraine, bilateral agreements with the UK, including with the US, where Ukraine participates in some of the drone dominance, programs. Ukrainian sea drones especially are being popular now in the US. So Russia wants to cut it off and cut it off at the high, because he understands once these bilateral links are really anchored and projects are taking place, it will be impossible for Russia to achieve its goal in insulating Ukraine and both making it weak, but also denying this technology and experience to NATO to defend itself against Russia.
And in the report, you also talk about the fact that Putin has not achieved his political objectives. Therefore, any so-called negotiation is likely to be temporary, because until there's a fundamental rejection of the desire to turn back time, erase, let's say, the changes from Maidan and the forces that's unleashed, then Putin certainly will carry on, maybe those in his circle. But I wanted to put this as a double question, because it also seems to me, until the broad mass of the Russian population have some sense of guilt and repentance and recognition of the crimes that have been done in their name, then it's not just Putin whose mind needs to change for this policy to be reversed. It is the broad mass of Russian people that need to accept that it's wrong, that Crimea isn't a sandwich.
Well, I think the fact creating facts on the ground where Russian military faces defeat on the sovereign Ukrainian territory is an opener to that conversation inside Russia, right? That is why not rewarding by a recognition of any territorial conquest and actually denying Russia ability to control Crimea and creating a cliffhanger for Russian army to actually lose control over the peninsula. It's important. Otherwise, none of these changes or conversation in the Russian mindset will take place. And Putin knows it, and people around him know it. And perhaps they would have wanted to change the narrative, but because Putin presents so much this war as a confrontation with Europe, confrontation with the West, right now he's refocused after Trump's in the White House to Europe really being an enemy, that he simply cannot walk back from this. It's a kind of a war trap for him, right? A ceasefire trap, a war trap. He has overreached way too far. So that is why Ukrainian people understand that the continuation of Russian revisionist imperialism vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Lithuania, Poland, you name it, the countries where Russians believe belong to their proper neighborhood, is such a dangerous outcome of this war. And this is what ceasefire creates. It creates a stalemate. It creates a tie where Russia still is encouraged to have another go at it, not to make a conclusion that this is unattainable or that this was a wrong policy, but actually blame it on the West for supporting Ukraine or find some external reasons to their debacle that they have created by invading Ukraine.
Well, yes, so far Putin isn't giving any public indication of having the slightest interest in walking back or even suspending the war, because after all, there have been plenty of opportunities for Russia to freeze the conflict on terms that would be advantageous for Moscow, but they haven't taken those opportunities. When we spoke previously about the other Chatham House report, how to end Russia's war on Ukraine, we were talking about the situation we're describing now, the ceasefire, freezing the line of conflict, as potentially one of the worst-case outcomes for Ukraine. And now the fact that it has vaulted into being one of the least worst outcomes is just a result of the way in which the support from the coalition backing Ukraine, particularly the United States, has not been sufficiently strong and sufficiently constant and reliable to put Ukraine in a better position. So Russia holds the advantages in terms of the timing at which this could be frozen, and particularly, as we discussed earlier, because they might be able to dictate the terms, but they have not yet shown an interest in doing so. Not just Putin, of course, but also the ordinary Russians we're talking about. We see the videos of Russians reacting to things blowing up and exploding in flames around them. And they are asking the question, what is happening? Why is this happening? But they're not yet reaching the answer because our leader embarked on a senseless war, and that is the reason why we are suffering in our lives today. And until that point is reached, until that connection is made in the broad mass of Russians' minds, we're not going to have any future progress towards that post-imperial mindset that is the end goal, the end state at which Russia no longer is a hard security threat to its neighbours. But the problem is that is still not just years but generations away. We repeatedly get asked, how long is this war going to last? And I think people sometimes assume that there's going to be an answer which is within months or years. But the sad fact is the war overall, of which Ukraine is the current front line, is going to continue for as long as Russia exists in its current form, and for as long as Russians do not change their mind about being entitled to an empire, and one that they should acquire through armed force.
And those indeed who opposed it have generally left the country and integrated partially into the societies they've left to go. And it seems that there's a younger generation, if you look at Ian Garner and some of the work doing there, of extreme war radicalization going on. So this is actually the foundations for generational struggle are already being imbued in the minds of young Russians.
Well, absolutely right. And of course, this is the counterpoint to the optimism that we heard until remarkably late in the post-Soviet period, that Russians, once they had escaped from the USSR, would suddenly turn into Swedes. They would be democratically, liberally minded. They would no longer dream of restoring the empire. But in fact, you've had the opposite process, not just through the processes of indoctrination and propaganda and war rhetoric that Ian refers to, but even such simple things as the romanticization of the Soviet past. When you have young people growing up with no memory of just how deeply grim life in the USSR really was, but seeing the old classic movies and not being told, well, this isn't really what was happening in real life. And so an ideal of what Russia was during the 20th century has replaced the reality for so many young Russians. And of course, when I say young, we shouldn't really be calling it young. This is anybody up to the age of about 45 that won't have the reality to compare it to, might have a dim memory of the 1990s when things were not as rosy, but all of that, of course, being blamed on the West rather than on the decisions of Russian politicians and the Soviet past that they were recovering from. So all of this together has taken Russian youth, those young Russian people that you're referring to, further away from what you might expect to be a peaceable European nation that can coexist with its neighbors rather than getting closer to it.
If I may, Jonathan, I'm glad we are discussing it, but because I think there's still a lot of illusion or wishful thinking in the West that somehow Russian public will be able to push Putin to end this war. And I personally do not think this is the game. This is not the leverage that they have in the current Russian system. Of course, they want this war to end. And we do know overall, because now the increasing attacks on distribution centers, the online Wilburys and gas storage, gas shortages. There's the discomfort of war that for the first time, finally, Ukraine managed to create for Russians, because previously, 2 years ago, they were living okay, knowing that Russian army is butchering people in Bucha. So, but I think it's interesting what kind of dilemmas the Ukraine, together with its allies, could create for Russian senior leadership in order to actually compel it to end the war. That is perhaps a subject of another podcast, and we did not, to be honest, discuss it in depth in our paper. But I think that the consequences of war for Russian society and for Russian elite are deep, and they will only go worse the longer this war lasts. What I think is interesting compared to Ukraine, that Ukrainian society, because it is an open and democratic society, is discussing and looking for solutions to the difficult traumas of the war, to finding ways of public-private partnerships to deal with the veterans. Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian civil society foundations are dealing with it, whereas in Russia, this is all being, suppressed and pushed outside of the public psyche to forget about it and to pretend that the war is going according to Putin's plan. And we just need to push a little bit and just a little bit more, and maybe another 300,000 people, maybe another 500,000 people, and Putin will win. And this is where we are actually recording this podcast. We don't know what kind of decision Putin will take towards escalation once he will really understand that he has hit the wall in Ukraine.
And this is something I think that's not discussed, but you start to allude to it. And we could tackle this on two fronts. We'll get the Western, let's say, and European response from Keir, but then the internal story around Ukraine, maybe from you, Orysia. And that is that unity is forged under fire. Western allied unity, such as it is forged in the context of war. The internal unity in Ukraine, absolutely. The old thing about, you have three Ukrainians in a room and you have four hetmen. Well, I saw that recently in action in Kharkiv, where I was, and it was interesting to observe that process. But that unity under a so-called phony peace could very well fall apart very rapidly. You could have internal political fights. You could have the sale of military IP, reducing the effectiveness of that. You could have exporting assets abroad, money leaving the country. You could have people leaving the country, widespread demobilization. And this could all potentially weaken the extraordinary resistance machine that Ukraine has built up. So let's start with Keir addressing how Western unity could fall apart, but then Orysia maybe tackle how Ukrainian unity could fall apart. And that is probably something that Putin is banking on, both of those things happening.
Well, yes, European unity is wobbly enough already, even under the threat of a major land war on the same continent. And we've already talked about the way there would be societal pressures to treat the war as over. That would also be conflict in between individual leaders of European countries, some of whom would be inclined to dissuade themselves from engaging in the race to rearm by pretending that peace is now at hand, and others, of course, as usual, the frontline states, recognizing that they may well be next in line. That's bound to create tensions between the people who understand the threat and understand the next steps, and those that still, after all this time, think that they are insulated from it by distance, somebody else's problem. And that's even before you get onto the whole issue of the role of the United States and whether, in fact, it is intending in the future to play a role in European security and what the limits of that commitment might be, which is something that is going to be preoccupying European states at the same time as they're dealing with the impact of an apparent end to the fighting. They will be thinking more about the US force posture review. They'll be thinking about their own means of compensating for their evident security deficit, and that is going to be a complicating factor in trying to deal with facing Russia's next steps and making sure that it remains in the front of the minds of policy planners and the public that this conflict is not over.
I think Ukraine has really, rallied around the flag in this existential fight, because for Ukraine, this fight is familiar. It's a fight that started centuries ago, where Russian Empire was trying to destroy Ukraine. And in a way, Ukrainians are good at finding ways to defend themselves, at this horizontal resistance, as finding creative ways without the state in a way. And this is how, the whole new way of waging the war was invented, between this partnership between private companies who are very good at IT and Ukrainian businesses who are financing startups, and the drone industry has emerged out of this partnership despite the state, not thanks to the state. And this horizontal relations between these companies and battlefield units allowed to really create the kill zone, defend Ukraine, and create a situation where right now we can be discussing, the freezing of the front line, where Russia absolutely fails to achieve any significant gains on the battlefield. But all of that is coming to a degree at risk, of course, when when you have a decompression effect after the war. And we've asked for our survey, Ukrainian civil society, what risks do they see when there's an ending of the war? And of course, there's a fear that Ukraine will have to spend a lot of funds to keep the functioning and effective armed forces, that it cannot allow itself to demobilize large number of men and women who are already in the armed forces, that it will have to dedicate resources for defense and security rather than for recovery, social recovery, veteran reintegration into civil life. And last but not least, indeed, that the internal infighting that Russia will exploit, for example, during the first post-war elections, will create a parliament that will be dysfunctional at the moment when Ukraine will need to implement very complicated structural reforms to integrate with the European Union. So I mentioned European Union because I think to a degree it's a kind of a straitjacket for Ukraine that is a mobilizing factor that creates this narrow corridor and focuses people's minds on what has to happen, because majority of people understand Ukraine cannot defend on its own forever. It's exhausting, it's costly, it's not something Ukrainian society wishes for. So it's trying to build these collective alliances, whether it's with the European Union, more for trade and eventually for defense, or for NATO, or build these coalitions of the willing with the countries that could come to its assistance and also make it a win-win for both sides. But yes, the effect of war on society are already quite devastating. You have large numbers of people impacted psychologically. You have quite high levels of poverty. You have out-migration, huge resettlement. But as I said, what is encouraging, and through our work in Chatham House, we really talk a lot to people who are finding solutions to these problems because they do not exist anywhere. It's not like Ukraine can take a copycat model from the UK veteran assistance. It's different environment. This is not a professional army. These people were mobilized from the civilian life, and they need to find ways to settle back. But I think that it's important that we do not lose sight, if there is a ceasefire indeed, and if there is a moment that hostilities will lower, that we really make sure we invest in human capital in Ukraine, because this will be necessary both for the armed forces and for Ukrainian economy, as Ukraine is in a real demographic dip, not only because of the war, but this negative trend was already before the war. So there's a big homework for Ukraine's stabilization of its economy and society, also when there is a pause in the war.
And this is again a question for both of them, maybe more majoring on Ukraine. What therefore needs to be done if there were to be a negotiated, or let's say, no conditions ceasefire? What would need to be done in Ukrainian society to build upon, and a resilience is a tarnished word, but to build upon the resistance and institutional, cultural, etc. strength they've got now, and military strength, rather than seeing it ebb away? Is there anything in Finland's experience or Israel's experience, etc., that could be learnt, or is it a whole local set of criteria that need to be learnt? And then the same question for Keir, but really based on what Western countries need to do to actually catch up with the ecosystem of drone warfare, which I have to say, speaking to Ukrainian commanders here, speaking to some think tanks who've actually been to NATO college and so on, I think privately they would say we are so far away from being militarily effective in the age of drone warfare that it's not even funny. But let's start with Orysia and what needs to be done in such a scenario by Ukraine.
Well, I would like to reclaim the resilience word. I understand that it irritates Ukrainians because we in the West are settling into complacency thanks to Ukraine's resilience. We think they're so good, so resilient. But I think resilience is an important concept for Ukraine's, how it organizes its affairs, because resilience is built on decentralization, on autonomy of its parts that are interchangeable. And that approach should be applied both to energy, which Ukraine, will have to massively rebuild, especially if there is no ceasefire this winter. It will suffer much deeper damage, and will have to rebuild its critical infrastructure in energy. That is the first thing that must be done to power the economy and to enable its industry to produce what is necessary for the armed forces. I think it's important that the first post-war elections, if they're indeed taking place after the parliament would lift the martial law, if security situation allows, are not rushed in, because this is where it will require quite a meticulous preparation to make sure the processes, the quality and security, and that the register of voters is properly done. And I would say we should remember that Ukraine is dependent quite heavily on Western funding, not just for its armed forces, but also for its economy. And looking at how if Russia is not paying reparations, which is unlikely, our assumption in the paper is that the ceasefire comes due to the military culmination rather than the negotiated settlement where Russia, in a way, agrees to some terms. It's simply by creating a situation on the battlefield and disabling Russian capability to wage the war against Ukraine that such a stalemate could emerge. But that also means that Russian sovereign assets must be repurposed further for rebuilding and recovery of Ukraine, especially for homes for people, because you see this year especially how much Russia destroys high-rise building, all kind of housing for people. And if people have no housing, they cannot come back either from other regions of Ukraine or from abroad. And this has a direct impact on Ukrainian workforce, which has suffered quite a lot because of war.
Yes, every military, not just in Europe but around the world, must be studying intently what's happening on the front line, what used to be called the front line between Russia and Ukraine, and trying to assess what of the lessons are actually going to be relevant for their own future wars they're going to be fighting. But that, of course, gives variations even among European NATO, because not every country is going to be facing the same challenge from Russia and be able to deal with it in the same way. So there's always the same debate when a change in the nature of a particular war and how it is being fought seems to say that a whole branch of warfighting technology is obsolete. There's always the temptation to throw out everything and start all over again. And what we're seeing instead is some very cautious and measured approaches to what exactly is the relevance of what we see in Ukraine. On the other hand, we also see some possibly armed forces being overcautious and playing down the impact of drones, because whether or not you treat it as completely transformative, the transparent battlefield, the ubiquity of drones, the inability to move either side of the line of contact in Ukraine, whether or not you think that is what future wars look like, I think you can't deny that the existence of the technologies now means that you cannot take for granted any of the previous concepts of force protection, of survivability, of movement. All of those now come under question. So at the very least, all of those need to be reviewed by Western militaries. We see some armed forces taking this seriously. They tend to be the ones that are large enough to actually dedicate specific units primarily to experimenting with the new forms of warfare and trying to assess them and exercise them and work out exactly what can be integrated with existing systems, particularly, of course, the United States, which is able to sign off major units to doing this precisely because it is so large. Other countries are going to have to make very important bets on the future, and we have to provide them with the best possible information to try to make sure that the bet is the right one.
The very last question here, and I strongly recommend people read the full paper, because there's a lot more scenarios in there. And as I say, we're going to interview two of the other authors of that fantastic paper that you were involved in. The last question here is that given the peace scenario, and unfortunately the kind of default assumption amongst many, as Orysia pointed out, ceasefire, peace, etc., in people's minds, that's a kind of peace, like the guns falling silent on the 11th of November, 1918, for instance. That's maybe hardwired. But actually, this is the point where Russia may try for a much larger provocation. Now, I know it's mentioned ad nauseum, the so-called Baltic scenario, or punching through the Suwalki Gap. Is it not equally likely that a major sort of hybridized assault could take place, or using drones or missiles at a distance against European city rather than kinetic? But is this period of peace actually maybe the point of greatest danger for Europe?
Well, certainly it's dangerous because of that combination of factors we've discussed. Russia able to rebuild its forces faster, being under less pressure from Ukraine, and European countries potentially taking their eye off the problem and relaxing their guard. But where exactly Russia might move next, yes, the Baltic scenarios are, as you say, repeated ad nauseum, but they are far from the only option. What Russia will see, looking at Europe overall and looking at the ways in which it wants to achieve its aim of re-establishing its control over those countries which Vladimir Putin says Russia voluntarily gave away, and correcting, as he puts it, the historic strategic mistakes that laid down the borders of Eastern Europe, they'll see their problem not in territorial control, but instead in the overall system that supports the sovereign independent nations that are close to them. In other words, it's not the existence of those countries as independent nations that is Russia's problem. It's the existence of NATO, the EU, coalitions of the willing, everything that binds together to protect them against Russia. So the weakest point, the single point of failure of any of those institutions is more likely to be where Russia is going to be concentrating its efforts. And that's a constantly shifting equation based not so much on military capability, but also on politics, on diplomacy, on the economy, on where Russia on any given day might assess that there's sufficient return on investment to be had to invest the risk and the resources in actually pushing NATO or a NATO state by targeting something which they believe is likely to fail, and at a time when they believe that the allies of that target are not likely to respond. So that's the situation that the whole of Europe still needs to guard against. In that respect, nothing has changed since before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But in the other respect, what it may be on any given day, that changes constantly. So we shouldn't be bound to prescriptive ideas of where Russia's options may lie. They are fluid.
And Orysia, to sort of close it out, what do you see as the risk of provocation? That if Putin does come to the conclusion that he cannot even take Donbass, etc., might he turn to, let's say, divisions, provocations, attacks on other member states, let's say, of NATO, etc.?
I think it's obvious that for Putin, some territorial control is just an expression of the war. It's not its ultimate objective. And his ultimate objective is to make sure that Europe is not able to defend its core strategic interests. And if Europe said that sovereign and independent Ukraine with territorial integrity is its sovereign and strategic interest, and that is important that Ukraine prevails, Putin wants to deny Europe also that opportunity, and he will play the long game by trying to exert pressure on Europeans to take wrong decisions or to use their vulnerabilities in a political information way in order to unravel some of the unity and to actually threaten some of these countries on the eve of elections in order to dial up the chances of anti-European, anti-union parties, more right-wing, more radical parties to get more chances of re-election. And he will play security escalation with the politics as one game, whereas in our understanding, often in many headquarters, this remains to be divided. So I think one of the lessons from Ukraine is that in this kind of a total war where society is a target, economy is a target, critical infrastructure is a target, we have to have a holistic approach. And this is where, companies and businesses have to understand that they have a job to do. The military has its share. Civil society has to understand about civilian protection and response around their communities. Mayors have to do the same. And the sooner we kind of embed the system within our societies, the less chance Putin has in imposing his will on Europe in many ways. And as Keir described, he has many options. And we'll only know, in Ukraine before the invasion, many people imagined how they would behave. But believe me, when things happen, you don't know how you will behave, no matter how well prepared you are. But I think that gaming and preparing for the worst, and for a longer war, like in Ukraine, people say, if you want to have a short war, you prepare for a long war. And I think understanding the mindset of Putin and his system is better to prepare for a longer confrontation and to have it shorter than the other way around.
That's a great insight. Thank you. And for those who want to imagine what that's like, I recommend watching the War Game series, which Keir was involved in, because that helps to sort of, dramatize that part of it somewhat. Thank you both for the incredible report and, of course, for making time to speak to the audience today. It's been tremendously insightful, as always, and I'm immensely grateful.
Thank you for having us.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Let's unpack the book, The Dark Heart of Russia, because it helps to explain how we got to this point. It's edited by me, Jonathan Fink, the creator and host of the Silicon Curtain podcast. It's published this month by Gibson Square in London and is already available for order and delivery online, though officially the PR release will coincide with the Phantom Victory Day parade in Moscow on May the 9th. 30 interviews, 30 voices selected from over 1,000 interviews that have been conducted on this channel. And the lineup that we have put into this book reads like a who's who of the people Moscow would most like to silence. Bill Browder, Garry Kasparov, Fiona Hill, General David Petraeus, Peter Pomerantsev, Luke Harding, Mark Galeotti, Keir Giles, Anders Puck-Nielsen, Alexander Etkind, Yuri Felshtinsky, General Ben Hodges, and many, many more. And with a strong set of Ukrainian voices included, it could be no other way. Volodymyr Ermolenko, Alena Holoshka, Sasha Dozhik, Olga Tokariuk, and Alexander Romantseva, among several others. And the timing is not accidental. We are releasing this book precisely as the Kremlin's central myth, the myth of Russian victory, Russian strength, Russian inevitability, is being shredded in real time. Ukraine matters, and I think this book matters, and our support for Ukraine is the only way of stopping Russian imperialism from its eternal outward expansion and the destruction that it brings in its wake.